Welcome to Let's Talk Global Business, the show in which we look at the economic and business trends connecting the world. I'm Sarah Murray, Managing Director International at the Conference Board, the member-led global think tank that delivers trusted insights for what's ahead. In this episode, we're looking at the fintech revolution in the GCC and the Nordics. Both are highly advanced and wealthy economies with relatively small populations, but they have radically different social models. The Gulf is known for its laissez-faire approach to economic development, built on oil, trade, and temporary migration. Scandinavia, by contrast, has established long-standing social democratic policies and a strong welfare state. As banking moves into an era dominated by technology, including AI, what are the implications for how both regions innovate, capitalise, and regulate their financial industries? And what can each region learn from the other? I'll be talking to Andrea Cates, Innovation Advisor, former tech CEO and Senior Fellow at the Conference Board, and Thomas Groh Jensen, CEO of Copenhagen FinTech. Andrea, Thomas, welcome to Let's Talk Global Business, and thank you for participating today.
Great to be here.
Thank you so much for inviting.
So, to set the stage, could you both start by telling our listeners a little about your respective journeys? Thomas, let's start with you.
Sure. I come from a long background in financial services, actually. And then in 2016, there was a report made in Denmark that kind of stated the challenges ahead for the sector, for the industry, but also some of the solutions. And one of the solutions pointed towards establishing a fintech hub and making sure that the Nordics is also positioned in this kind of global arms race of financial technology. And I thought that was pretty much aligned with what I have been working with for a lot of years, and also at a point of time in my career and my personal life where I was ready to take on some a little bit of different challenges. So you might say I'm a recovering banker. So I was hired in as the first CEO for Copenhagen FinTech and was tasked to kind of run the hub and position Copenhagen and to some extent also the Nordics in financial technology and try to grow that ecosystem. So that's kind of my journey in.
Excellent. Thank you, Thomas. Andrea.
My journey is really, in some ways, very similar to Thomas's, but I'll emphasize a couple of beats in my story. So number one is I specialize in helping companies get unstuck. And what that means is that there are blind spots and opportunities that we miss as teams or as companies because we're just used to doing what we're doing. And suddenly some new force comes in the market and wow, what do we do about that? So what I've always done, and it started years ago when banks were, sort of debating, should we have automatic machines, the ATMs, because, would people take cash out on a street corner? Literally, that's how long ago I started thinking about innovation and technology in the financial services markets. And amazingly, there was pushback. Then there was pushback for e-commerce. And then there was pushback with all of the issues of trust and security back then. Well, the second beat of the story is that I was hired to be the CEO of an innovation software company. And I was so lucky to live in San Francisco and to look at 13,000 teams and see how some of them stayed stuck. They never made the transition from where the market was leading and where the customers were needing to go and where they were. And so I started really worrying about this. How do you get teams and companies out of their own way and unstuck? And I've worked with large companies all over the world. It's been really fortunate. Well, the third beat of the story was when I realized I had been working in the Nordics for a long time. And I noticed that there was something really interesting happening where a group of people decided to take a region and take data and put them together and say, might we become a leader in global fintech using the resources and technology advancements and sort of leapfrog quickly into a market leadership position. That's how I met Thomas and have worked with their Copenhagen FinTech for years and have been fortunate to be a speaker. Well, my final beat of the story is that I've worked now all over the world with Open Finance Mexico, for instance, I'm working on a book right now called From Stuck to Scale that looks at companies like Rappi and how they became an omni-channel platform, starting with a sandwich delivery service in Latin America, and now are a fintech platform. And so the article that I just finished writing for the conference board on the GCC is that final transition point that brings us to today's conversation. What's happening in the GCC that is really head turning, and why will they succeed, and what do they have to look forward to tomorrow?
Fantastic, Andrea. And when I listen to just, the stories of yourself and Thomas and the commonalities between both of you, the importance of culture and the importance of the ecosystem seems to be, a common thread that you have within the Nordic region. So I am particularly interested, based on that very strong experience that you've had in the Nordic, when you now look at the GCC, what's driving that growth of fintech, in the region? And, if you compare that to 5 years ago, what's the difference? Why now?
Well, I think there are actually three things that are really important compared with 5 years ago in GCC. And I've worked in various countries in the GCC, and even a few years ago, there wasn't the advance in cloud. There was an acceptance of cloud. There were not really the digital mindset was more around taking today's transactions and turning them into digital. I also think the regulatory environment has been shifting, and whether it's the trust that regulators have in the technology or vice versa, I think that those are three big issues. So I would say that the biggest change from 5 years ago to today is the willingness and I would say, innovation of regulators, whether it's the Saudi central bank digital currency. These are big movements in terms of a shift in the mindset. So that's one. I think the acceptance of cloud, the fact that we have so many companies getting consumers comfortable with apps and with cloud transactions is a second big thing. And I think the third really has to do with that underlying theme that I'm sure Thomas will talk about as well, which is trust. I mean, innovation in consumer goods, if you're going to buy packaging A or packaging B, that's one mindset. But when it comes to our money, the trust is about 10x in terms of what's required. So I would say that those are the three biggest shifts I've seen that are really creating a huge sea change of opportunity for everybody in GCC.
It's really interesting, Andrea. I mean, I think the biggest takeaway that I have is, the environment that's needed for that innovation to flourish. A big part of that is on the regulatory side, right? What changed for the governments in that region to be more open to that?
I'm going to say something that's usually a little bit controversial. I don't know that regulators would have changed if consumer behavior hadn't changed. So picture Andrea, and I have a day where, I'm ordering food delivery on Talabat, and I'm doing rideshare on Kareem, and I'm using WhatsApp to talk to my family. And my day is full of using my mobile device. And then there's this huge gap, and I have to physically go to the bank and wait for paperwork ABC and red tape 3 weeks, 4 weeks, and all of these different kind of requirements that were a bit cumbersome. Well, if the consumers are becoming more and more comfortable with the digital experience and the app experience, it's almost as if the regulators had to follow the consumer comfort level. And that's very interesting to me, that you have the interaction between the voters, the citizens, the people who are living in the country and the culture, and the regulators being quite responsive to that. There's a lot more complexity to it, in terms of governments and from country to country. But I would say that that's a really big driving force.
And how did they evolve? How did the regulations evolve to then accommodate those fintech players? So obviously, the spark is the consumers asking for more, more kind of putting consumer at the heart of it. But then what happened?
I think that a few things happened. So the banking leaders, especially the ones we've discussed in the article, are quite forward thinking. Everyone's global now. These things used to be secret, but now everything's transparent. How is it done in one region or another? They look around the world and realize that it's important for the GCC to be a global player and to be able to trade and have partners and this notion of an ecosystem. And when the bar changes in an ecosystem, it's felt all over. So I think one thing is the global, I won't call it peer pressure, but awareness of region to region and how we would in the GCC sort of measure up. The second, I think, is the proliferation of accelerators. So whether it's the fintech hub in Dubai or Qatar or Saudi or Bahrain, there's lots of accelerators that started. So people would they would go to conferences all over, get excited, get innovation groups from within large banks to start thinking innovatively. And then I think the third thing is the generation of talent, right? So we have talent that's really comfortable in these new arenas coming into the workforce. So you have somebody in their 20s and it's just much more natural for them. So I think that those are the kinds of forces that, number one, you have the force of the consumer. Number two, you have the global ecosystem awareness. Number three, you have talent proliferating innovation through accelerators and hubs. And that combination of forces, I think, makes it much more of a possibility that there would be a culture within the countries, within the region, to be on the global stage through fintech.
Thank you, Andrea. Thomas, I'm really keen to get your perspective here from what you've already heard. How does the Nordic experiences that you're used to compare with what Andrea's just said about the GCC?
Yeah, so I think there's definitely a lot of similarities. These are some of the most digitized countries in the world. Like usually you'll find in various rankings, you find Nordic countries, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Finland, very high up on any rankings when it comes to digitalization, right? The infrastructure, and especially actually the financial infrastructure built, which to some extent is actually, and I think we can talk about that a little bit later, almost becoming a legacy infrastructure, but still an infrastructure that works really well inside of the Nordics. It's often built as a public-private partnership, and very often with the financial industry as a partner, coming down to the digital ID, digital identity, and many of the government services in the various Nordic countries are run on that infrastructure. If you look at the level of innovation, usually also very high up in the Nordic countries, and then there's a few things that makes it extra interesting, and I think if you look at some of the most sustainable countries and where sustainability and ESG is very high up on the agenda, not only in the financial industry, but in general, you will see the Nordic countries. And that creates a very fertile ground for that special combination of sustainability, climate, ESG focused financial fintech startups, and that's where we really see really a high growth in these kind of solutions, because they're also a demand on the consumer side and for small businesses, also in partly driven by regulation, right? And then you take data access, so both access to public data and also partly driven by EU regulation. If you take the PSD2 regulation, which is about sharing your financial data with third parties, open finance, which is about sharing all financial data with third parties. Now soon the AI Act and stuff like that. I think so. The data access and in general very collaborative environments that are built on high degrees of trust that Andrea also talked about. These are some of the ingredients that makes the Nordics really special.
Yeah, and actually, I would love to piggyback on what you just said, Thomas, because I worked in the Nordics for 13 years now, and it to me it's the conscience of AI comes a lot globally from the Nordics. And it's not just lip service to ESG, it's not just lip service to sustainability, it's not just lip service to trust. There are specific proactive, insistent practices. So for instance, if you're looking at authentication with blockchain, maybe 5 years ago or so, those same abilities can now be applied to authentication for AI. So the Nordics actually globally, and I'm not saying this just because you're here, Thomas, I actually believe in comparing regions need to know what they're uniquely amazing at, right? And uniquely, everybody can do the same apps now. You can deliver this, that, or the other fintech service anywhere in the world. But what's different, and what I think is really great about today's conversation, is the Nordics have a distinct and authentic advantage in being the conscience behind some of this regulatory or even innovation gone wild. You don't want innovation gone wild because it's our money. We need someone to be thinking of the risk and the planet and the generations to come. So I would say uniquely, that's something that I would characterize as a big win. And a lot of the innovations, as I said, starting with blockchain and authentication, from the Nordics, are something that we all look to throughout the world. And I think that now, as the GCC, I think it's wonderful that it's not bad to not want to be first at everything. I think the GCC has some really unique assets, not just in its oil transactions and energy expertise, but there's global leadership in thinking about how assets move across borders. That starts in the GCC. Tremendous power, in a good way. Tremendous numbers of relationships. So I think the GCC would be able to characterize its amazingness at being able to not be first, but be strong, not necessarily be the most, prolific innovators, but to be innovators who think about I call it measure twice, cut once. So they look at what's happening and can make the proper move for their region. And I think the third is something, Sarah, you were saying in terms of the ecosystem. You can afford now, if you're not first, to sit back and really draw the map. What will it look like for us to put all the pieces together in the GCC so that the regulatory, the banks, the innovators, the young talent, the all of the technologies can marry together and bring everybody forward?
Excellent. Thank you very much, Andrea and Thomas. Before we move on, I'd just like to take the opportunity to inform our listeners that they can access the full report on the future of banking in the Gulf, preparing for a new era. And it's on our website, conference-board.org. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll be diving into fintech for the Nordics as well as globally, what this topic means for business leaders and what insights they can take away to help navigate the complexities, or should I say the opportunities that lie ahead.
Are you ready for the future of business? This year we are launching our international conference series. Curious about emerging trends for rewards globally? Join us June 20th to 21st in Brussels for Future Reward Europe. Want to understand how partnering can help with the war for talent? Save your seat July 4th to 5th for Future Skills Asia in Singapore. And finally, tap into the power of ecosystems at Future, Innovate and Transform, November 13th in Amsterdam. You can find details on the programme at conference-board.org/conferences. Join us to get inspired, gain actionable solutions and connect with global peers.
Hello and welcome back to this conversation with Andrea Cates and Thomas Groh Jensen, exploring the fintech revolution in the GCC and the Nordics. I want to turn to you now, Thomas, and look more closely at what's happening in the Nordics. What would you say are the most exciting innovations to have emerged from the Nordics?
Super good question. Thank you for that. And I think going back to what we talked about not so long ago, like some of the some of the trends or what you see as the positions of strength for the Nordics in for instance, sustainability. And I think if you take that area, I think what we're seeing there, the number of startups that is working within that, whether it's ESG screening for asset managers or it's carbon accounting or that kind of space, ESG sustainability, I think that's definitely an area where we see the Nordics punching above their weight, and where you see a lot of interesting innovation going on there. And I think some of them, Sweden is emerging as a very strong ecosystem for that, together with Denmark. We're just in these weeks finishing a report on that specific that will be out very soon, where we map out that ecosystem for sustainability startups that working within the fintech space in the Nordics. I think if you take a little bit also linked to what we talked about before with high levels of trust, and so I think another example to talk about, to make it very concrete, is a company called Chainalysis that moved in to the lab back in 15, 16 when we opened. And it's a Danish founder, and now they're headquartered in New York. At that point, 10 people, now 850. So really like a fast scaling company, and they're working with the infrastructure and kind of creating that transparency and traceability within the blockchain and crypto economy. Could they have come from other ecosystems? Probably yes. And they're a global company now. Is there a reason why they emerged from the Nordics? I think so. And that's like that focus on, hey, we have a really a really interesting technology here, but also with some built-in needs for making it more transparent, traceable, and working with governments, law enforcements, and big financial institutions to also make sure that what's going on there is compliant, right? So I think a company like Chainalysis is a good example of what emerges from the Nordics and some of the innovation that comes out here. And other than that, I think if you look at, for instance, two of the global giants, Mastercard and Visa, where did they go when they wanted to buy some open banking infrastructure? Well, they went to Sweden and Denmark.
It's really interesting, Thomas, because what comes out loud and clear is the ecosystem within the Nordic region is incredibly tight and strong and dynamic and fluid, and that everything is flourishing, and that's why you've got the reputation that you have for that ecosystem. But in terms of how the Nordic position their ecosystem within the global one, you mentioned that Visa and MasterCard clearly spotted, the players that they wanted to work, and they come. But is the Nordic also looking outwards and going out into that global ecosystem in order to kind of help it scale?
One of the challenges, to be completely honest, is the challenge of scaling some of these solutions. Partly because they're built on that very highly digitized infrastructure that to some extent is very special for the Nordics, right? So it's both a blessing and a curse, but also because it is still a fairly small economies in a smaller region, which mean the home market, these companies need to think about scale from the beginning because it's very small home markets. Their home markets, even the Nordic region, is basically, or should be, just a test bed, and then they need to scale these solutions, right? And that's what I think what we are trying to work really intensively with these founders and companies is kind of build for scale from the beginning, and make sure that you don't build for something that is really good and works in the Nordics, but as soon as you move outside of the Nordics, it doesn't really work, right? So that's clearly one of the you're touching upon one of the challenges.
Because again, the social approach in the Nordic region affects regulation there, right? But that's within the Nordic area. So indeed, the minute they go out of that, hey, it's a different kind of level playing field. So how have they succeeded at that?
One thing to add is, I think we very quickly, at least part of our strategy, realized that we will never be able to build the biggest in terms of absolute numbers ecosystem companies and investments and so on and so forth. But we would be able to and should build maybe the most connected one. And I think that's also one thing that sets it apart, that it's a very collaborative but also very connected environment. That means that there's a network and a community to scale on top of. And that's a little bit coming back to, I think, what Andrea also talked about, and I think what GCC also should be and are working on also, and part of the report you published also, Andrea.
Really interesting. I think that leads to my next question, Andrea, which would, if you to think about the key lessons that players in the Gulf could learn from the Nordics, what would you say they are? If they were, top 3 lessons that they could implement now, what would they be?
The top lesson I would say that GCC can learn from the Nordics is this notion of interoperability, to really build not just from our own institutions, but right from the beginning, to realize that the more we are a network, the more we are an ecosystem, the more interconnected we are in the GCC, the better, because there's a free flow and everybody gets educated. Everybody raises their standards at the same time. So I would say that's number one. I think number two is kind of something that is a combination of what to learn, but also where to distinguish. To me, data in AI, in trust, in everything, data is about to hit a revolutionary, radical moment that has never been before. And we always say that every 5 years or so, oh, data is the new gold or whatever. But in this world, the trustworthiness of the data, the proliferation of the data, and now the deep kind of power of the data, good or bad, I think is something that the Nordics have benefited from because they live in a digital world. But I think actually the GCC can leverage and double down and say, we're going to become leaders in this new era of AI. We are going to become leaders in a point of view around how to handle data, so that we step forward, maybe not with the same regulatory or ethical standards that are in the Nordics, but what is the question that that the GCC is looking to answer with regards to this data, and to step forward with the regulators, large companies, and these non-finance companies that we mentioned, to really have a point of view around it. So I think that data is a place that we can learn, and we can also, and GCC can also distinguish. I don't live in GCC, but the paper represents it. So I think that's number two. And I think that, when you think about technology, my final point is, whether it's big data or networks or AI or digital processes or open banking or cloud or consumer behavior or APIs, everybody needs to get much more fluent. Everybody needs to get much more fluent in all of these technologies, hands down. And so I think that that's lessons from the Nordics, GCC can apply. And it's also opportunities to distinguish GCC as it moves forward into the next era.
I think what strikes me when Andrea talks is, I think what is interesting here and the big opportunity for the GCC is that there is I don't know if you would call it a burning platform, Andrea, but there is a big wish to diversify the economy, right? And if you look at the Nordics, that might be a little bit different, right? Because we're a little bit fat and happy. What we can learn the other way around is, I think, what the GCC and what we see not only in that region, but I think we've been highly inspired also in what's going on in Asia, especially in India and Singapore, and to some extent also in Japan. And all of a sudden, if you take India as an example, the India stack and the infrastructure there being built in Singapore and Southeast Asia, what they're building now in terms of also the financial infrastructure and the how they attract global players to the region. I think that is something that we can learn, and that comes from a very, very ambitious regional strategy on how to be a player here. And I think, to some extent, a little bit in the Nordics, we lean a little bit on private markets to make it happen, and not necessarily that very specific strategy on a on a national or regional level to kind of facilitate that change. And I think that's what we see in GCC. I think that's what we see in Asia, and what we could learn from. Be more data driven, be more strategic in our approach to develop certain industries, including fintech, in that respect.
I mean, it's very clear, Andrea, from the conversation today, and from the excellent report that you've written, that the GCC is very well positioned for the future of banking. Any other takeaways, Andrea, that you would add for businesses, whether in fintech or looking at ecosystems from the outside?
I would say my final piece of this is all of the ingredients are in place. The ability to look around the world, and Thomas mentioned some other regions to look at in, whether it's Asia or whether it's Latin America, or wherever it would be, and pick some of our best things that are already happening. We don't need to be inventors. We need to be the best chefs using ingredients that are already in our kitchens. So I would say that it's a brilliant time for GCC leaders to apply these ideas, to maybe diversify the economy as the call to action. Some other very important movements that they can start that bring their common talents to bear and really leapfrog. It's really poised. GCC leaders are really poised to collaborate and therefore leapfrog into a whole new era of fintech and economic opportunity for every country in the region.
Thank you. And this brings us to the end of our episode. We'll be back next time with a focus on Asia and Europe. And you can listen to the entire catalogue of podcast programming from the conference board by visiting our website. Thank you so much, Thomas and Andrea, for sharing your insights with us. Really appreciate the time that you've taken.